Hello, everybody, and welcome to the May monthly webinar from PMO Advisory. Our session today is going to focus on risk management. The title of the presentation is Everything About Risk Management, as well as the PMI Risk Management Professional Certification. Throughout this presentation, as you have questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question, but I do appreciate if people can remute yourself, especially if it gets noisy. The other option to ask question is use the chat message. As you can see, there's a chat box that we're ready. There could be a little bit of interaction, so feel free to use that to address any questions. In case that there are questions that I'm not able to answer or we ran out of time, feel free to send me your questions via email, and later you'll have my email information, but it is twu@pmoadvisory.com. This session is being recorded, so without further ado, we'll get started. Today, we're going to talk about really the risk in complex projects and the ubiquity of these risks occurring. We'll look at the process of identifying, evaluating, planning, and executing risk. We'll talk about some of the risk evaluation parameters, which I believe is actually quite important. This risk evaluation parameters, jumping ahead a little bit, is actually really more based on the PMBOK 6.0 and not the RIC standard. So the information in this presentation is really based on three major sources. One is the PMBOK 6, second is the Practice Guide to Risk, and the third is the latest global standard for risk management that was published literally about half a month ago. Next, we'll talk about how do risk management credential enhances the professional qualification, especially those with PMPs. Then we'll talk about some of the principles in this latest standard for risk management for project programs portfolio. And we'll also provide a detailed overview of the PMI's risk management professional certification, and then follow up by some summary and conclusion. Now, this webinar does earn 1 PDU, and at the end, we'll also provide that information. As mentioned before, this session is being recorded, and once we have the video ready, we'll post it on our website at pmoadvisory.com/webinar. And that webinar page contains also our past as well as future webinars. So let's get started about the risk management. So what are risks? And as you think about it, we live in a risk-adjusted world. I think all project management professionals, especially those that's certified by PMI with PMP, CAPM, or even other certification, there is a great awareness that risks exist at many different levels throughout the projects. Understanding risk gives us the ability to better anticipate and in some ways to mitigate against the threats as well as leveraging the opportunities. So in many ways, because project today is becoming a primary mechanism for organizations to make change, this aspect of risks also permeates throughout the entire planning as well as the execution. Some examples of risk endeavors, or I should say risk endeavors that aren't handled particularly well. I brought out three examples here, starting with the Samsung Galaxy Note 7S. This was 2 years ago, 2017. It's probably still relatively fresh in people's mind. This Samsung Galaxy 7S spontaneously exploded and burst into flame. What was detrimental to Samsung wasn't even the initial, but was that when the recalled, the fixed version of the phone released to the market, it also exploded. Eventually, it was banned pretty much everywhere. And I teach at Montclair State University. This is one of the few times I heard a device is actually banned on a college campus. So not to mention planes and trains and ships. Another example, which is really happening as we speak, and every day there's some new development around the Boeing 737 MAX, is the tragedy of the plane crash. Now here, we're still, of course, going through a lot of root cause analysis, looking at what went wrong. But from a project management perspective, at least two things that we know fairly certain. One is the concept of single point of failure. In this case, the anti-stall mechanism on the max plane was really based on just one sensor. And that created a bottleneck, so to speak, in which all the risk is aggregated to one single sensor. The other risk, as we know, is that there were, let's just say, inadequate training, as well as communication. Even though Boeing implemented this new system in order to avoid costly training and retraining of pilots, for whatever reasons that we're still uncovering, we do know that they minimized that change in order to avoid the expense and the hassle of training. Of course, that led to the tragedy of eventually losing 346 souls. One of the other things I want to call out is the security breaches. And this, to some extent, is my bias. I don't have data to prove this, at least not comprehensively. But I think as the world started shifting more and more toward agile project, which agile methodology, agile project management, Scrum, they all have very, very valid reason why they work so well in selective industry. But it also creates a foundational shift in examining risk at a more platform or fundamental level. And that's my belief. Again, I don't have data to prove this, but I see more and more security breaches all over the place, from the government to private companies to smaller to huge breaches, for example, from the Home Depots or the Marriott, the Equifax. So to me, that all those indicate a lack of fundamental understanding and appreciation of really understanding and taking risk into consideration. So risks is in some ways actually all around us, and they exist especially on complex projects, because by the nature of complexity, there could be a lot of interactions that is poorly understood at the beginning, and really only looking at hindsight in that you have a better understanding and feel of all the various permutations and combinations. A 4-year study that was performed on risk management practice across 35 large projects in 17 technology companies concluded that about 1/2 of the risks are not even detected before they were actually felt. So on IT project, this is one study. There's an earlier study. This study is a bit dated. I think it's dated about 16 years ago, when people look at that time, the 9 knowledge areas in the PMBOK. Stakeholder, I don't believe, was there at that time. And they looked at the PMI PMBOK and did a study on the practitioner, how often people practice schedule management, time management, cost, resource management, as well as risk management. The irony in this case, and later I'll even show you a chart to sort of illustrate this point, is even though risk is one of the most popular concepts, even in PMBOK, for example, according to that study, it is the process of risk management is the one that's least practiced. So now you have, as you can see, a dangerous trend. On one hand, risks are pretty much ever present on projects as a whole, especially the larger and complicated ones. On the other hand, project managers are so busy, they may not spend time really adequately managing and tackling the risk. Now, one thing I should mention is risk in my example so far has been overwhelmingly negative. From a risk standard perspective, from a risk management practice perspective, risks are neutral. Risks are uncertainties. And should they occur without, especially without some kind of foresight, they become really surprises. Now, if you think about it, they could also be positive surprise. So for example, there could be, let's just say, hurricane. Obviously, for the people felt the impact of hurricane on their local region, power outages, broken windows, etc., that is, of course, negative. But for, say, the construction industry, the roofing industry, all that is actually a positive outcome. So risks in this pure sense on projects are neutral. There are surprises, there are uncertainties, especially if they're not well managed. But if you can anticipate the negative risk, which we call threats, then you could try to lessen, reduce, or even shift the financial burden, such as buying insurance in the case of hurricane. With opportunities, though, is that's positive risk. If you know that in advance, you can plan accordingly, then you can, of course, definitely exploit that risk more. So in the case of Boeing 737 MAX, the duopoly, Airbus is the other major airplane manufacturer. If they actually could anticipate that, they could ramp up their production, and I'm sure they'll get some more business from customers not ordering 737. Yesterday, there was a report that Boeing has 0 order in the month of April. So maybe that's just a delayed purchasing, but I'm sure if Airbus has the capacity, they probably could also siphon off some of those customers. So for Airbus, could be a positive risk that one of your primary competitor, of course, is not doing well. So let's look at the risk management process. There are really 4 steps in the risk management process. And I'm sure people could carve out 5th or 6th step if they really want to. But to simplify here is that we could just take a simple 4 steps approach to managing this risk, starting with identifying risk. And it's fairly straightforward. I think all the practitioners here have understanding that by understanding and analyzing and identifying the risk up front, project managers have a lot better opportunity and more time, in this case, to tackle the risks. So we have to know what the risks are, and there are a lot of great best practices. For example, in the latest PMI, we talk about stakeholder management, and one of the key roles of stakeholder, especially in the initiation planning phase, is to work with those stakeholders and understand the world from their perspective as it pertains to the project, so you can identify the risk. You also give the project managers the higher chance to analyze and plan for possible mitigation strategies. And risk register, of course, is a fairly common practice. Now, I would say from my experience, most project managers, especially good ones, tend to do this pretty well. They spend time upfront in the initiation, the planning, and it doesn't matter if it's a traditional waterfall or even a Scrum project or another Agile method projects, is they spend the time upfront understanding the nature of the project, the supporting organizations, the team members, the strengths, the weaknesses of the various situations, and they plan accordingly. So this step is actually fairly common. And from my experience, most project, especially project manager of large and complex projects, spend time upfront doing this. Evaluating risk is the second step, is exactly what it is. The project manager start looking at the risks that they have identified, and they figure out what are the factors that matters the most, and they could either quantitatively or qualitatively analyze the risk. Now, later in the presentation, I am going through 11 different factors from PMI, and all of those can be evaluation criteria. It depends on the nature of the project, your sponsoring organization, the emphasis of the team. Those factors can play a big part in this evaluation. The third piece is planning the risk. This is when planning risk response. So from the evaluation of the risk, I'm sure there's some going to be higher priority, others lower. And as the project manager have time, especially focusing on the higher priority one, they wanted to figure out what is the proper risk response, especially should the risk happen. So ideally, of course, there should be a risk response plan for all risk. I do have to say, I always find these terms, even in PMI or other guys saying, focus on all stakeholders, all communication, all risk, to be highly impractical. In reality, project managers are usually so busy with so many different factors. And this is what makes evaluating risk that much more important, because now you can allocate your very limited resources to the most pressing problems. But for these high priority risk, and whatever that priority is based on, it is worthwhile to think through, should the risk occur, what happens? How do we respond to it? If it's a risk that you want to mitigate, what are the strategies to mitigate that risk, to lessen the impact of the risk, or to shift that risk to somewhere else? And when the risks do occur, or right before it occurs, what are some of the trigger points, contingency plan that can happen? So these are all in this area of planning risk response. And then finally, implementing the risk response. Risks are probable events by definition. So, which means some of them actually just don't occur. They may dissipate. For example, if it's a hurricane and it was forecasted to hit your area, but as we know, a couple of days out, hurricanes are notorious for the unpredictability. So they may shift out to the sea, for example. So the risk just dissipates. But when the risks do occur, whether it's positive or negative risks, they do become issues. And by definition, issue itself is still largely actually a neutral term. It just means now your project is impacted. There are either obstacles or changes to that particular project. So project managers and risk owner can apply the risk response that was done in step 3. And of course, not all risks and issues have a detailed plan. So in this case, the business judgment, the ingenuities, the other skills are applied to tackle the risk. After the issue is now well under control, it is important to perform a post-action analysis to see what was done well and what could be improved. What's more important is often that there could be residual risks or even new risks that came from the previous risk. So for example, a hurricane may have done damage to, let's say, the foundation of a building. So now that foundation becomes a completely new risk. So that's an example of new risk that comes out of the formal risks. Now, let's go back to the planning side. We talked about the various conditions or factors, and I think the proper word that PMI uses, the parameters, in which project manager may need to consider as they think about the various weighting factors and setting priority to the risk. Again, the actual emphasis and the prioritization will depend on the project, on the sponsoring organization, on the pressure points, the organizational factors, and maybe even environmental factors of the project. But here I went to PMBOK 6 because PMBOK 6 has actually a very nice list of these parameters. The 6 that I think that's most common, and I say me because it is my personal experience, the most common ones are 1, the probability, which really is just looking at the likelihood of risk occurring. That's pretty straightforward. The second is impact. This is the potential effect on the project, positive or negative, should the risk occur. So these two, the probability impact on what most people probably use in your projects, at least by my experience. But going beyond these two, there are actually 9 more. Strategic impact. This is not just impact on the project itself, but beyond the project, the impact to the organization. So for example, I still remember when Apple came out with the iPad, the first generation iPad. Almost immediately, you hear rumor on the street that Microsoft and Hewlett Packard shelf their tablet computer, or tablet device, I should say. And of course, the reason being is when I'm pretty sure Apple came out with this new piece of glass called iPad, and at the time, I think there were about 30,000 applications when it first released. Project teams, product teams in Microsoft, HP, and I'm sure other companies look at that and are quite amazed by what that one piece of glass can do. the impact to their internal project isn't just immediately saying, oh God, we got to come up with better features or lower the cost or something, but it's a fairly strategic impact because that product that Apple built in some ways are so much better than the rest of what the competitors are doing that it really impacted strategically their product strategy. One company, by the way, that didn't really heed the internal warning and came up with the iPad, a tablet computer to compete with iPad, for those of you who may remember, was actually BlackBerry. BlackBerry produced a tablet on the market for a fairly short time called Playmaker. That, of course, they quickly had to do a fire sale, I think about 6 months later, just to get rid of it. And we know what happened to BlackBerry as a company. So that impact is a story of a strategic impact, not just on the immediate project, but on the entire product direction. The fourth one is manageability. This is the ability the risk owner, as well as other project stakeholders, to tackle the risk effectively. So how well can an organization manage the risk? And sometimes risks are just difficult to manage. And that may push the prioritization to be a little bit lower. So for example, if it's a relatively low priority risk, impact is assessed to be moderate. It's very, very hard to manage. The management team can legitimately say, you know what, we'll just accept this risk. Should the risk happen, we'll go tackle it at that point. Fifth one, detectability. This is the ability of the risk owner, as well as other stakeholders, to actually see the risk and recognize the risk when it occurred. In real life, we usually don't have very clear road signs. When risk occurs in the background, it could be attributed to any number of factors. So there, it may not be immediately detectable. And sometimes when it does become detectable, of course, it could be a little too late too. So the detectability of a risk is another area to consider. 6, urgency. This is the window of time available to effectively respond to the risk. And a good example is always come back to hurricane because they're really just great to provide a lot of stories. I'm sure in the last couple of years, we have seen situations in which the governor or the mayor declare natural disaster, for example, in Houston 2 years ago, but frankly, it was a little too late. There was not enough, everybody trying to evacuate the city and logjam everything. So in this case, the window available to respond to the risk, in this case, get out of the way, unfortunately was too narrow. So a lot of people had to stay put and sit through the storm. So these 6 parameters, probability, impact, strategic impact, manageability, detectability, urgency, are what I believe to be the more common parameters, especially the first 2, probability and impact. Let's look at the other 5 parameters, which I don't think is as common, but they can play important roles on your particular project, starting with proximity. This is the window of time in which a risk can affect one or more of the project goals and objectives. So usually high proximity means that the window is relatively short. And once that it occurs, you have to now act quite quickly. Dormancy, another factor. This is the window of time in which the risk has occurred, but its impact went undiscovered. So this often happened with the pandemic disease, right? There could be people already getting sick, but we actually don't know it, or we don't know what attribute to it. So the dormancy period can be particularly long. And in our recent history, for example, we have disease like even AIDS in the 70s and 80s stayed dormant for quite some time before people start picking it up in the seriousness of this disease. Number 9, controllability. The ability of risk owners to influence the risk impact and outcome. Now, this one some could argue should be on the previous slide because it is a little bit more common. So if you are able to control the factors contributing to that risk, then we may be able to shift the risk's outcome as well as the impact. Connectivity. the 10th one. This is the interconnectedness. And this one is actually a particular interesting one in the new risk standard that I was honored to be a team of, part of that team creating. Because we were looking at risk not just on project, but across project, program, and portfolio. And we actually also tied it to the strategy of the sponsoring organization. So in this case, it's the interconnectedness of this risk in relation with others. You know, a good example of this is in project management resource risk. Especially, let's say, resource, a precious resource, a scarce resource, let's say an architect getting sick and not showing up to work. That obviously could impact your project. But that risk actually can be rolled up as well as rolled down. So rolling up at a program level, for example, is maybe the entire program has not enough resources, in this case, say the architect. And if you roll up to the organization, if the organization plans to do a lot of these projects that requires the architect and it doesn't have enough architect, then it becomes a talent management issue for the entire organization. So these risks are quite intertwined and connected. And it, of course, can be applied to almost any of the precious resources or the strategic risks that connects throughout the project program portfolio, as well as the organization strategy. The last risk here, number 11, is an interesting one. I don't have to say, I don't come up with very, very good example, but this is something called propinquity. And it is an interesting factor because it's somewhat subjective. Propinquity is the perceived importance of risk by the stakeholder. So you could have 3 people in there. One of them is, for whatever reason, maybe they're very close to this particular risks, believe the risk to be far higher priority than the others. So it is a subjective reason, but usually based on experience and sometimes can be based on data as well. So these are the 11 factors that I thought is very important for people to understand. And there could be more. If one question I have as a favor to me is if you think of other attributes and parameters of risks that's not covered here, please definitely let me know. So now I'm going to jump a little bit to the new standard that I've been proud of being a member of the team to create. And this is the first edition of the Standard for Risk Management in Portfolios, Programs, and Projects. A couple of words on this. This standard is what we call a principle-based standard. Now, earlier, someone asked the question. Unfortunately, I only have their phone number, so I don't know the name of the person. Asked the question that the PMI, for example, has the publication called Practice Standard for Project Risk Management, and it's a decade old. It's still a very good book, by the way. I still think it's a good book, but it is a decade old. The Practice Standard is very much of a process-based standard. So for example, you didn't only cover the 4 processes that I mentioned before, you also talk about 8 different strategies dealing with the risk, 4 for threats, 4 for opportunities. It also provided quite a bit of background, various tools and techniques. So that's what we call a practical hands-on how-to guide, and hence it's called the Practice Standard. PMBOK, as many of you are familiar, is a process-based standard. PMBOK has 10 knowledge areas, 5 process groups, and there are 49, I think, processes in the latest PMBOK. But if you look at the standard for portfolio or the standard for program management, now you started shifting away from a process-based standard. So not so much the different process that's prescriptive, but more talking about what are some of the commonalities, what are some of the sort of the truth, put that in quote, that we hold to be true for this particular discipline. And that's what the principle-based standard is. And the risk management standard for risk management in portfolio, program, and project follows that theme. So here, I'm not going to cover the entire standard. Obviously, it's pretty long, and I'm just shifting there. You could see if you go to PMI.org, go into the PMBOK guide and standards and foundation standards, you can see the new standard. And for those of you who are members, you could sign in and download this for free. But what I want to talk about are the the 6 major principles that we built into this new standard. So in some ways, these standards serves as what we call fundamental truth. And I put truth in quote because what's truth, of course, can still be somewhat subjective, but I think most practitioners, risk management professionals will agree. So these 6 principles are follows. 1, striving to achieve excellence in the practice of risk management. One of the major problems that we have seen is that there's a lot of lip service paid to risk management. As I went through the process, I mentioned that a lot of project managers actually do spend considerable time upfront identifying and evaluating risk. What happened, of course, is after that initial round of identification, evaluation, prioritization, chances are they got pretty busy. Most professional project managers are what I call like an octopus, 8 arms trying to fight fires with 1 arm, placate somebody else on another arm, scheduling something for something else, working with vendors, customers, managing expectations, etc. So they got so busy that they often don't come back to the risk register or keep it fresh. So what I have seen in risk management is that most large projects, especially complex project managers are very good at upfront, tackling the risk of identifying, evaluating, planning the risk response, and of course, putting some things into execution. The risk register by 2019, this is fairly common. It's bread and butter of what project managers do. But how often do we go back to review those risks, refresh those risks? When new change occurs, go back to that risk register and say, what does it mean for these risks? And I wouldn't say the inability, but the infrequency of doing that renders the risk management practice to be subpar, especially on projects that deservedly need to have that attention. So that's what the first principle is, really thinking about risk management throughout the project, not just at the upfront and then later because of busyness and etc., putting it aside. Second, align organization strategy and governance practices with risk management. Risk management needs the support of the governance of the sponsors. Because in some practical terms, if you think about it, project managers are generally and often so busy fighting fires. If you're already worrying about putting out the fires in front of you, how much time do you really have worrying about the prevention of the next fire? And the short answer is not a lot, because the urgency is pretty clear. There's a fire burning, things are being hurt one way or another, project, put it out first. But by putting all that urgency, working on the urgent fire, often what you forget is, of course, the next fire could be even bigger and the heat can be more intense. So in order for risk management to truly work on project, it requires the support of the governance practices. And this is also closely aligning with the organizational strategy, making sure that the risk management practice is in support of the strategy, and hence you're more likely to get the support you need in the actual practice of risk management. The third is emphasizing the need to focus on the right risk. Now, the problem with risk, and by the way, I am as guilty as anybody else, I think, is that we often play Monday morning quarterback. Oh, only if they'd have done this, or only if they should have done that, or only if we knew this would have happened. Of course, any of those statements are probably true. On the other hand, rather late. And this is one reason that later in my professional career, I actually started becoming more mum, even when I audit and evaluate projects, because I realized sometimes inadvertently I'm playing Monday morning quarterback. But now the core reason why I went through those 11 attributes earlier is those 11 attributes, I'm sure there are a couple more that you may have in mind, help you and help us hone in on this right risk. Because the reality is project managers are busy. We probably cannot focus on every single risk. We only have a handful of risks that we are able to intimately manage. The rest we have to bring other people, risk owners. And if we focus on the right risk, and if we don't have enough resources, then we can go to the organization sponsors and governance and justify why we need resources to manage those risks. So the prioritization of these risks and understanding the various parameters do become that much more important. Number 4, finding the optimal balance between risk and reward. One of the key aspect of managing risk is, of course, understanding what is the cost of not managing it. And the cost of doing nothing, if it is relatively low, then maybe it is not worth managing, even though there could be other reasons to. So you have to balance between the risk and reward. Now, one thing I will say is sometimes project managers are rather optimistic people. I mean, you almost have to be a project manager working on complex and large projects, because let's face it, there's so many different challenges. We often, being the optimist is good. It keeps us going, keeps a team energized, etc. But we also sometimes don't see the consequence or the full consequence of certain things not done. I had a client, and this is some years ago, and they lost somewhere around $450 million in about 45 minutes. It's a high-speed trading company called Knight Capital Group. And just for the record, they were my client after they lost the money, not before. They were working on a fairly routine project, was updating a bunch of legacy system with updated software for high-speed trading. So from a normal analysis of risk perspective, the risk is pretty low. It's something IT shop, almost all IT shops do on a regular basis. But what they fail to see and understand is what is that single point of failure and what are the consequences. And the consequences on that trading day in August, now a little more than 10 years ago, some of the system didn't actually work as expected. So the system should have prevented from some of the short sale from going through the system. And instead, the operator pushed the button and let the short sale through because it was just a bottleneck in the system without realizing the consequence. And what happened that over the next 30 minutes, approximately 45 minutes by the time they shut down the system, a lot of the orders that shouldn't have gone through or otherwise wouldn't have went through, creating a loss of trading for that day in that 45 minutes, approximately $400 million, and ultimately actually killing the company. You could see that, by the way, even in the Boeing case, the Boeing 737 MAX, right? Let's focus on training for a second. Training is fairly expensive for pilots, and at a certain amount of threshold of change, they have to go through fairly comprehensive training. So one of the selling point of continuing as existing sort of set of technology and know-how how to operate the plane is you don't need as much training. And that was one of the selling point of 737 MAX. So Boeing, in this case, actively, for as far as we could tell, worked with FAA to minimize the amount of training required, and hence the cost of adoption of the 737 MAX is going to be less expensive. They may save pennies, of course, up front, but we now know the consequence of that. So finding that optimal balance of risk versus reward sometimes requires imagination, and ask the question of what is a relative worst case scenario. And in this case, for Boeing, of course, I think it's a little beyond relative worst case scenario. It is some of the worst case scenario that we have seen in the aviation industry in recent years. Number 5, nurturing and promoting a culture that adopts risk management practice. Risk management is typically spearheaded by the project manager, but it should not, the project manager should not be the sole advocate of the risk management. It requires an entire team, if not an organization, to have that right mindset, to pay attention to the level of detail, to have the antenna up, to look across the next bend in the road, what are some of the uncertain activities and events that may happen. So it requires an entire change in culture of people understanding that we live in a risk-adjusted world. Some of them are so implicit we don't even think about. For example, in the morning when I commute to work, in my mind, I probably have plan A, I'm going to drive this way. Plan B, if the road's congested, I'm going to take some local road. Plan C, something else. So we're so pre-programmed that we don't even think about. Well, on projects, sometimes we do have to think about it. Usually on complex projects, there are literally infinite ways of getting to the end. And as we carve out what are the best path one, plan A, plan B, plan C, we need to think about that risk and help us build toward achieving that goal. And finally, number 6, navigating complexity to enable successful outcome through the practice of risk management. Risk matters more on complex projects because there are permutations and combinations and connections that we frankly cannot see easily. Most human, most professional, intelligent human have the ability to maybe process 4, 5 pieces of information simultaneously. And the sort of rule of thumb, 5 plus or minus 2, meaning typically at a minimum, most people could process about 3 things, at maximum process about 7 things. I'm probably right around average, somewhere around 4 to 5 things. But even at 7 things means there's a very, very severe limit. So as a project manager, the extent to which we can help the organization involve people, stakeholders, team members to help us navigate this complexity, especially when there are a lot of connections, that will help us improve the ability to manage risk. So those are the 6 principles. Now, I should mention, as you have questions, please jump in. So far, I have not received any question on the chat. Please do jump in with questions. Now I'm going to turn my attention to the risk management profession, PMI RMP. Okay. So what we see is that there's quite a bit of need for risk management and the risk management certification in the marketplace. The previous example that I just gave are some of fairly prominent examples of failures of risk management. And I'm fairly sure all of you have your own examples, probably even from your workplace. PMI RMP certification is a specialty certification, is the way I look at it. It's not just built on the plan to, the traditional route of, the PMP, PGMP, PFMP, but this goes into a more specialty area for managing risk. It is a competency-based exam in the sense that when you pass the PMI RMP exam, you inherently have the knowledge as well as the skills to practice the risk management. And as you can see from here, this is a fairly updated chart of the number of active certification members across the APMI certification. There are right now around 5,179 risk management professionals. So it's a fairly still low number, not quite in the infancy, of course, and it is growing. Okay, so there is something for you to consider, especially if you already have PMPs and you want to stand out from the rest of the crowd, so to speak. The requirements are pretty straightforward. The fee is $520 for members and more for non-members. And generally, it's always worthwhile to be a member and pay the member fee because that still come out typically less than a non-member. Not to mention you get all the standards for free now you could download. And the requirements are pretty straightforward. Assuming you have a 4-year degree, then it's 3,000 hours of project management experience and 30 hours of risk management education. The exam itself is 3.5 hours, 170 questions. And if you do the math, it's approximately 74 seconds per question. The exam can be only taken at the test center. And by the way, PMI is moving to Pearson VUE, so they're no longer at the previous test center. What makes the exam difficult? And these are some of the things we have seen. One, rapid pace. You have only 74 seconds per question. And if you look at that, that's actually very little time. Most of us, for example, takes about, I don't know, somewhere in the neighborhood of, we read about 70 words per minute on something technical. When we read fiction, we could probably read up to 150 to 200 words a minute. So about a third to a half of that for technical material that we want to understand. 74 seconds really aren't that much time, because most questions on the exam, and you throw in the multiple choice, there's usually 4 choices. So if you throw in the answers in there, somewhere between 80 to 120 words. The 6 principles, the words that you saw before on the previous slide, that itself is already 64 words. So in a minute, we could barely get through the question, not to mention now we have to think about it and obviously find the best answer. So that's just the pace. When I took the RMP exam some years ago, I actually took it on 9/11. I purposely put it on that day on 9/11, I lost a cousin, so I wanted to celebrate his life by getting a certification on that day. Some years ago, I still remember that halfway through the exam, about 2 hours into the exam, I actually didn't finish half the question because the question were very long. And a lot of the question was also interpreting graphs like Monte Carlo simulation graphs and outputs and reports, so that even took more time. So time crunch is a real factor. The second part is the questions are typically not really just looking for correct answer. Most questions are experience-based or scenario-based, so it's not so much the correct, right versus wrong. Rather, it's more based on the best answer. So the best answer, of course, as you can imagine, requires a lot more processing, a lot more thinking than just simply identifying the right answer. So for these 2 reasons, assuming you have good risk management experience, you still need to have quite a bit of practice so you can do it efficiently. So just beyond the knowledge. Now, I just saw a question that came out. Is the new standard recommended for studying the current PMI exam? Is it replace the old standard for risk management, or should we wait for exam update? I know the ECO has not been updated. I'm asking for those preparing to take the RMP. So that's a great question. So thank you, Susan, for asking the question. In my conversation with PMI, and I do have fairly regular conversation with them, the current RMP exam is based on the practice standard that was first published in 2009. It is not based on the new global standard that literally came out half a month ago. So far as I know, there is not a plan to move toward the new global standard for the RMP exam. That doesn't mean it will not do that in the future. The ECO is typically an output from a road delineation study that PMI tend to conduct approximately once every 5 years for at least project management. For risk management, I do not know the next cycle for updating that. So my short answer to Susan's question is simple. From the test-taking perspective, the guide in which you should focus on still continue to be the practice standard that was first published in 2009. The new global standard for portfolio, program, and project should serve, and you should read through that, as a reference guide. These 2 standards are very, very compatible. What my core team did in the new global risk, and I shouldn't say my core team, I was just a member of the core team, there were 8 of us, is one of the major input was the practice standard. But we also expanded the scope from just a project-centric view of risk to that of more of an organizational wide view. And then later we customize it and narrow it slightly to include the program and portfolio view. So the two standards are actually quite compatible. My suggestion, though, for studying the test is still rely mostly on the practice standard. Having said that, the exam was first developed many years ago, well over a decade ago, and by now, the exam questions can also be refreshed. So chances are PMI, it has been moving toward more of a move to include more program and portfolio concept. So I think the new guide will help, as some of the new exam question will probably reflect that program mentality as well as portfolio mentality. So thank you for that question. So how do you prepare the exam? There are two ways, really. You can prepare the exam by yourself. If you have the time, the experience, the confidence, you can self-study and prepare for the exam. It is challenging because it requires quite a bit of motivation. And if you have questions, of course, you may not have a reliable source to get the answer. But it is doable. And after all, for any of these certification exams, your goal shouldn't be going after 100%, but instead going after the passing grade. Our suggestion is spend 90 days at least to prepare and make sure you spread out the time. Now, 90 days is the minimum. So this is not to say you can spend less. You obviously need to concentrate your time more. For most people, half a year, 90 days or half a year is a good benchmark. The document to focus on, as I mentioned, the practice standard for risk management, I still think is the top priority. But I would take a look at the new global risk, mainly because it starts to encompass a lot of the concepts around program and portfolio as well. PMBOK, by the way, is also a very good guide. Chapter 11 on risk management, I think, is still a vital input. And then PMI also published a reference list. For those that's interested to have some help, and I guess this is sort of a plug for my company, is PMO Advisory is one of the few REPs that offers certification boot camps for not just PMP, which practically everybody does, but also for program management, portfolio management, agile, and risk. And we have developed and been using something we call IntelliCamp, which is a live virtual real-time training environment. It is 12 hours total, so we typically organize it in 3 sessions of 4 hours each. And it's also supported by e-learning. So it's really a blended learning of real-time, live virtual, so people can ask questions to the instructor. And you can also email instructor afterwards, of course. But also combined with the flexibility of e-learning itself. And for those who have PMP, you can also earn 12 PDUs. So here you can see some of the future dates for the course, should you be interested. My company is also selling it right now at 50% discount. So it's $8.99 after the discount. So it's a really attractive price. Okay. Some summary and conclusions. I would say the takeaways are as follows. Risk management, the importance of risk management, I think is going to become ever more important on especially large and complicated projects. This is because we have seen just too many failures of poor risk management and the consequence on project. Risk management is a relatively new field. So this is number 2, especially as applied to project. PMI standard on risk management for portfolio, program, and project is just a move in that direction to make sure that the practitioners in this area truly understand how risks can impact the overall goals of the portfolio, program, and project. And number 3, risk management isn't just about simple tactics and understanding. To practice it well requires a foundational change on how people really think about risk from a cultural perspective, as well as involving the governance to have the right resources. So here in this table, you see the sort of a word count. I went through Pinbox 6 and used Adobe and quickly count how many times do these words occur. And to go back to an earlier point I made, risk management, even though it is one of the most commonly mentioned words in Pinbox, and this proves it, right? Risk itself is 1,000 times more, or at least 800 times more than cost, the word cost and financial combined. Even compared to words like stakeholder, it's significantly more resources, schedule, and so on and so forth. But it is still one of the least practice of the PM project management processes. Well, thank you so much for staying with us till the end of the presentation. We have about 5 minutes, so if you have questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask them now, or sending through the chat message. But for those who waited to see the code, claim code for the 1PDU, you can use this claim code 41728 WWOUA, and you can see the breakdown of the PDUs by the talent triangle. 0.5 technical, 0.25 and for strategic as well as for leadership. Are there any questions? Okay. If there are no further questions, we could go on. And by the way, we will send this out as well. Once the recording is established, it will be also on our website under pmoadvisory.com and pmoadvisory.com webinar. So feel free to copy down this claims code, or you can wait for the video to come out. There's another question. Is PMP a requirement? No. The short answer is you do not need to have a PMP in order to qualify for the RMP. And to be clear, in PMI world, there is no certification that's dependent on another certification. So all A certification are standalone. Even though there's some logical order, for example, CAPM to PMP, but they're not dependent. And RMP is completely independent. So good question, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, well, I'm gonna end the recording now. I just wanna wish everybody a very happy Wednesday. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you soon. Take care.